don't mind, Greg, could you introduce yourself a little? Just the department you're in, kind of what your speciality is, how long you've been working at the uni, all of that good stuff.
Sure. My name is Greg Radick, and I teach the history and philosophy of science within the School of Philosophy, Religion, and History of Science at the University of Leeds. To my amazement, I've been here for over 20 years, and I am in love with the field, and I still can't believe my luck that I get a chance to teach in it and to research in it. My particular interests are in the history of biology and what are called the human sciences from about 1800 forward. So that typically includes psychology, anthropology, economics, the sciences which purport to be able to tell us scientifically what we're like. And of course, biology is first and foremost among them. So within biology, I have particular interests in Darwinism and genetics and animal behavior. And just now I'm attempting to complete a book about a big debate in the early years of the 20th century about whether Gregor Mendel's experiments with peas should or shouldn't become the basis of the new science of heredity. So that's the kind of thing that I work on.
Interesting. Amazing. Well, you kind of went into the first question, well, the first official question. So how did you get into your subject area? So what was it about it that kind of interested you or attracted you to the actual profession?
Well, as an undergraduate in the United States, in New Jersey, which is where I'm born and bred, you can probably hear that I'm not a Yorkshire native.
What? I think you're from
my sons are, but I'm not. And while as an undergraduate, I majored, as Americans do, in history. But I had entered university really without knowing quite which way I wanted to go. And in the United States, unlike here, you don't have to declare until after your first year. So I ended up jumping towards the humanities, but I never lost my interest and my appetite for science and mathematics. And just towards the end of my degree, I began to get a sense that there was a field of the history of ideas, and it touched on the sciences. And after I left uni, I had a chance to explore a bit more intellectually, and I found my way back to the sciences and mathematics, and I thought I just have to bring this into my life. And I initially thought that was going to take the form of me becoming a medic, which again in the United States is a little different than in this country. You become a medic as a postgraduate degree. And so I went back to uni and studied basic sciences for a year. But then through one thing and another, I ended up coming to this country and finding out that there was this thing called history and philosophy of science, which I'd never heard of. But as soon as I saw the name, I thought, that's it. There's actually a name for these interests that I have, because I had found that I adored science and mathematics, but I wasn't especially good at the doing of it. And in some ways, the doing of it was a little tedious and didn't suit me. But everything else about science and mathematics I thought was just amazing. The ideas, finding out about the people behind them, how it fitted into the wider culture, into ideas about philosophy and religion and politics. So once I discovered that you could actually study this, that was my path.
Great. It's amazing how niche it is, but it still manages to find its way to different people. I don't know, something about it that I just quite like. Before I came to uni, I never really knew about this specific subject. And the actual degree that we're doing, there's only 6 people in the country at the moment that are going to graduate in 2021 with this actual degree, with history and philosophy of science. So yeah, it's quite exciting.
Amazing. It's a source of frustration to some of us that it remains permanently niche, no matter what we do. And so often after our courses, the students say, wow, I wish I'd known about this earlier. And we do our best to spread the word and hope. We have History and Philosophy of Science in 20 Objects free online course. And just this year, it's the basis for an essay competition for secondary school students in the UK. So we're hopeful that that will help spread the word before they fill out their UCAS forms. That actually there is this thing called the History and Philosophy of Science. It is completely amazing, and it can be part of your degree at Leeds and as you say, elsewhere. When I have a chance to pitch the subject for students planning to come to university, I describe it as addressing those questions, those awkward questions that come up from time to time in the science classroom, the conceptual questions about, quite what we're doing when we're doing science. And they're the questions that teachers in a science classroom typically just don't have the time to get into. And they also aren't questions that everybody wants to address. Some people just want to get on with it, but some people want to slow down and think about the difficulties. And those are our people.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many layers to it that's easy to kind of skim over and just go for the nitty-gritty side of science and the practical side. But yeah, there's a whole other world to it, which is quite interesting as well. The next question, you've kind of talked about it already, but how did you get into lecturing? So after your undergraduate degree, what was the path that you took into teaching?
Well, immediately after my undergraduate degree, as I said, I graduated with history as my major, and I didn't quite know what I wanted to do next. Unfortunately, a buddy of mine and I had been traveling during my third year. It was actually my first year, and I studied at the University of York as a junior year abroad student. So I was one of those Americans that you find in your seminar.
Amazing.
Talking away. This buddy of mine took me on my interrailing, and we ended up in Prague. And this was in the early 1990s, and we just fell in love with it. And he was very enterprising, and he found us jobs at a secondary school in a Prague suburb. And so after university, I taught English for 2 years at a gymnasium, as it's called, in Prague. And I loved it. And I discovered that I loved teaching, that it's a job that I just felt great about, waking up in the morning, ready to do that. I just came to feel after a couple of years that I needed something a little bit more challenging than English as a second language to teach. And I found it, in abundance in the history and philosophy of science. But I actually entered the field. I began advanced studies, my master's studies and my PhD, with the view that I wanted to become a lecturer. But it was that chance to do it for 2 years in a high school in Prague that gave me a chance to discover that for myself.
Oh, amazing. Did you come back to the UK and then kind of discover the whole history of science side of it and the master's and postgraduate side of it? Or was it in Europe? Because I know quite a few places in Berlin and Prague and places like that, they've got quite a big research team in the history of science as opposed to other places in the world. So was it there that you kind of discovered your calling?
No, well, yes and no. It was while I was in Europe, but not because I had any connections to any of those sort of research centers. And also, I should say, the university where I did my undergraduate degree, which is called Rutgers University in New Jersey, actually has some superb people in the history of science and technology and medicine. And I just happened to miss them all. Just toward the end of my studies, I took what was called an honor seminar in quantum physics. It was sort of quantum physics for poets. And the teacher had, I think, the superb idea that if you want people to understand, if you want humanists to understand what's so radical and interesting about quantum physics, they have to understand the historical story. And so in that course, I had a taste of the history of science. It wasn't called that, but I thought this was marvelous. It gave me a way back in that really spoke to me. And this is, again, I think something we find with people who like our subject. For them, somehow, science approached historically so that you see why it is people began to ask the questions that they did, and why it is they ended up answering them the way that they did, and what it meant at the time. Somehow it speaks to them more directly. It makes it all more intelligible than when it's presented to you in a science textbook as if it just dropped from the skies. Anyway, that was certainly true for me. So I had a little exposure to it while I was an undergraduate. But while I was in Prague teaching, I just had time. And so I had time to explore in my readings. And it was through reading that I came to read in more depth people like Stephen Jay Gould. I'll be saying more about it in a moment, an evolutionary biologist, wonderful writer on science and the history of science and Darwinism in particular. And more generally, to rediscover for myself just how much I loved having science and mathematics in my intellectual life, and how brilliant the history and philosophy of the subject was as a way in for me. And so it was because I had the leisure, frankly, after uni, to poke around and read widely, that I was able to make my way back into the sciences. So it was only much later that as I said, that I discovered that you could actually do this at uni, and that there were people who studied it professionally. I didn't even know any of that had a name until I was looking for a master's degree. And by that time I was thinking about Cambridge, and I discovered in the course prospectus this thing called the History and Philosophy of Science. And even there, I should say, at Cambridge, I ended up there because the young woman who's now my wife, she had a job there. And she had a job in the city of Cambridge, in the town. And I had no idea. Of course, I knew it was a university. It's one of the great centers for the history and philosophy of science. And I kind of lucked into that. So luck, as ever, is a big help if you can get some.
Yeah, amazing.
Nice. And then moving on to the next one, do you have any advice for being published in a journal?
I do, and in a lot of ways, I've said what I think is most helpful to say in a video that anybody can access on my personal website. It's gregoryradick.com, and under teaching, I've put a video of a talk that I gave at a postgraduate conference in 2007, 2008. And by a series of miracles, that video ended up being preserved. And I'd always intended to turn what I said into a written guide, and I never managed it. And so over the years, I've found that some people seem to have found that helpful. It's specifically focused on how you write a journal article. And one of the major pieces of advice is that you do your best to choose good examples, the articles that you've loved and been fascinated by, and study them, figure out how they work, and to realize that at a certain level, a journal article in the history of science is a piece of genre writing, kind of like writing a Western or a romance or a detective fiction. These are recognized genres that have their conventions, and there are people who are outstanding, right, in being able not only to observe the conventions, but to subvert them. And so I try to encourage folk to consider the history of science journal article as a genre, to study the best examples that they can find. I mean, the ones that fascinate them. In the video, I choose an example, an article by a historian of science called Stephen Shapin, who's an outstanding writer and craftsman, and just try to break it down, to demystify it, to show how does it work? How does someone like Stephen Shapin actually write an abstract? An abstract for an article is actually really, really hard, and no one ever really tells you how to do it. And so in the video, I show at least how someone like Steve Shapin does. So those are, I guess, the most important things that I would say. And maybe finally, this might be a theme I come back to too. Be prepared to put in the work. As they say, easy reading, hard writing. Usually something that seems effortless typically takes a huge amount of backstage work, and getting knocked back and getting feedback, which is a little disheartening, but you keep moving forward. That's all part of the process. So I think to go into it expecting that it's going to require a lot of diligence and kind of self-confidence, but also a willingness to keep revising, keep improving, improving. And then it will reach that point where it looks as if it must have been like that in your head from the start. But that's just an illusion. You'll have produced that through hard work.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
I know it's going to be really helpful for some of the students that are looking into taking history of science and philosophy of science after their undergraduate studies. So thanks for that. I think we're going to move on to some less technical questions.
Lighter questions.
Yeah, lighter.
Yeah.
So we can get to know you a bit more. Well, the first question is, what's your favorite book?
Well, I'm going to cheat if that's okay.
Okay.
Because I prepared 2 books earlier, one fictional and one non-fictional.
Okay.
My fiction choice is one that I've only read recently, but it's zoomed right up to the top, and it's James Joyce's Ulysses.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's reputed to be the best novel of the 20th century, and it is. It's just kind of mind-blowing. I had the good fortune to read it with a friend who was himself a PhD in English literature, which may have helped. It is, I think, a lot of people are defeated by the book. It's really interesting when they ask famous authors about books that have defeated them. It comes up over and over and again. So I think I would recommend reading it with others so that you have a commitment both to read the next chapter and to keep going, and also to discover together quite what it's doing, because it's just the most extraordinary creative achievement. It takes the whole of Western culture and yet somehow plays it for laughs in telling us the story of a few ordinary people living a quite ordinary day in Dublin in 1904, I think it is. And of course, there's nothing ordinary about ordinary people. That's the part of the beauty of the book, is that we're inside their heads and inside their lives. And it's so inventive formally in what it shows a novel can be. There's a chapter, a quite famous, notorious chapter called Night Town. And I won't say any more about it for anyone who hasn't read it. But on one interpretation of it, it's where the book itself is falling asleep and dreaming. It's just remarkable. So that's my top novel for fiction. For nonfiction, it's really, really hard for me to choose. But I think for these purposes, I've chosen this book by Stephen Jay Gould, who I've already mentioned, one of the people who really excited me about what I now know to call the history and philosophy of science. This is an essay collection called Dinosaur in a Haystack. It was published in the mid-1990s. I always find, whenever I get a chance to introduce students to Gould's writing, that they love it. He died in 2002, and before he died, he had spent 30 years, believe it or not, publishing an essay a month without missing, a month. And this is while keeping up the most active professional life as a paleontologist you can imagine. He still published a popular essay a month, always beautifully written, always exploring some aspect of Darwinism and evolution and history from an imaginative perspective, bringing in literature, science, politics, philosophy, kind of like Joyce in that way, someone with an omnivorous appetite intellectually, but able to turn art out of it. And so Gould's writings, I think, have been a kind of permanent source of pleasure and instruction for me. I'm still making my way through the collected essay writings. This is one that I've read, back to front, but there's still a lot more for me to enjoy. So those are the books I would choose.
Yeah, how many would you say he's published in his lifetime then? Essays?
Oh, well, I think there are about 10 essay collections.
Wow.
Yeah, they're about
impressive.
10 and then on top of that, probably about 5 or 6 books, some of them really important books. And I shouldn't neglect to say that you'll recall that I was a student abroad as an undergraduate at the University of York. Well, Gould came to Leeds.
Oh,
Oh wow, there you go.
Yeah. Gould was in Leeds in the 1960s as a geology student, and he would often talk about how important that time was for him because he was politically a man of the left, and one of his passions was for, which in some ways I guess I've picked up on, was for trying to undermine attempts to show that somehow biology determines what people have to be like, which often feeds into sexism and racism. And Gould says his time at Leeds was fundamental for him politically because it was while he was at Leeds that he joined protests in Bradford, right next door to Leeds, against a color bar at, well, sometimes he says it's an ice skating rink, sometimes it's a dance hall. But it's something he returns to over and over again. So there's actually a Leeds connection in Gould's story. But he's such a beautiful writer. I couldn't recommend his collections more.
great. Oh, I might have to look at that.
Nice bit of Christmas reading for you there, Free.
Holidays are sorted.
Right, well, leading on from that one, we now have what is your favourite film?
I had to think about this, but in some ways this is easy because, like so many people, I just adore The Shawshank Redemption.
Always a solid choice.
If it's on TV.
A film student here. Look,
say that again, Fariha.
You're talking to a film fanatic, I should say.
Yeah, I'm rather fond of my film, so that's a fine choice, I must say.
Oh, good. You approve?
Yes, I would. It's one of those ones where I can't really see how you wouldn't like it, really.
Well, I think that's well put. I think that there's something perfect about it as a piece of the filmmaker's art, and that's why you can't stop watching it once you start. It tells its story in such a masterful way, and the more you watch it, the more you appreciate the inventiveness of the cinematography and the way that the music is used, and I think I've since read that the actors themselves, once they read the script, just felt they had to be part of this movie. It just has also a kind of perfect script, both as structurally and in the remarkable language. Maybe also in some ways as an American abroad, I love the American speech, and it's pungent and it's poetical, and yeah. So that and of course the movie is about good and evil and justice and friendship, and so it's in some ways the most old-fashioned kind of film you could possibly imagine, and it's all the better for it.
Yeah, definitely a classic.
Yeah. And recently, the filmmaker is a guy called Frank Darabont, who is not his name does not join the list of Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, and yet he's made this film, which is just extraordinary. And there's another film he made that I've only relatively recently become aware of, called The Green Mile, which is likewise based on a Stephen King story, likewise a prison story. This one has a supernatural element, which the Shawshank Redemption doesn't. But it is, in its way too, just the most watchable, moving film. And so, yeah, this fellow Darabont has just made these two classic films. All credit to him. Yeah. So those are I think they're certainly up there. But I see that, Dave, you have a Jaws poster.
I do. Yes, wall. Indeed.
Jaws is also, I think, up there for me. Again, almost a film I could almost quote.
Oh yes, indeed. It's eminently rewatchable and just too much fun every time I do.
Yeah, what's your favourite film, David? Sorry, I know this isn't your interview, but
now. My favourite film is actually a film called LA Confidential, which is slightly less well known. It's a neo-noir from the 90s, and I'm a big fan of it. And it's one of those ones where it kind of crept to the top of the pile just because I absolutely adore it, and less people had seen it, and I was like, that's a good pick from my favorite.
And you, Fariha?
I'm not as much of a film fanatic, but I'd say my favorite film is Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind.
Great film.
Oh,
With
I haven't seen that in years, but I remember really enjoying it. I actually saw that in the cinema.
Carrey.
Yeah.
That was a beautiful film.
Oh, I would keep an eye out. I would watch that again if it came on.
Yeah, definitely. Right, so if we move on to the next question, oh, this is a fun one as well. If you could travel anywhere in time, so any era, where would you go? And why?
Well, another toughie, but I'm going to say the 1890s.
Okay.
Nicely specific. I like that.
Say that again.
Nicely specific.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I could be even more specific, you know. But I think that era, especially in Britain, fascinates me. The man who became the central figure of my master's dissertation, which became a PhD dissertation, which became my first book, which is called The Simian Tongue, The Long Debate About Animal Language. His name was Richard Garner. And the 1890s were the decade when he became quite unfeasibly famous for these experiments that he had done with the Edison cylinder phonograph, which was then pretty new. And what he had done was to record the utterances of monkeys and then to play those recordings back to the monkeys and watch their behavior. And on the basis of all of that, he claimed that he had discovered what he called the simian tongue, the monkey language. And that this monkey language showed that language, like all other human faculties, had evolved, just as the Darwinians were saying. So that language was not some kind of a barrier that the evolutionists would never account for, that language too could be shown to be rooted in our animal ancestors. So he came to Britain in 1892 to talk about his work en route to Africa, where his plan was to sit himself in a big cage in the jungle with his phonograph among the gorillas and chimpanzees and take down the missing links of language. And so I lived for a long time intellectually with Richard Garner. It'd be terrific to get to know him and spend time with him. Likewise, now the book that I'm finishing now, I commune quite a lot with a fellow called Raphael Weldon, who in the 1890s was based in London, also working on Darwinian topics, but in a different way. At that time, he was especially interested in trying to see whether through statistical studies of crabs in Plymouth and elsewhere, he could demonstrate that year on year natural selection was occurring. And through a really remarkable research project, he did so. And he ends up being very important in the debate that kicks off after 1900 about Mendel. So the 1890s would give me a chance to hang out with Richard Garner, to hang out with Raphael Weldon, but also Huxley would still be alive. The 1890s in London were generally just so lively. People like H.G. Wells, part of the scene. So I think the 1890s for me would be fin de siècle. That would be the place and the time.
Well, the next question is quite similar, so you might have some crossovers in your answer, but if you could have dinner with a celebrity or a conversation with any dead person, who would it be and why?
Well, he's outside the era I just chose.
Oh, okay.
But an evening dinner with Charles Darwin would be pretty amazing, I think. Again, Darwin is someone I've spent a lot of time with intellectually. I live in Ilkley, which is where Darwin was when he published The Origin of Species. And that's actually another little book that I wrote with a friend of mine, Mike Dixon, about Darwin's 9 weeks in Ilkley in the autumn of 1859. And it was such an interesting book to write because I felt like by concentrating on Darwin's life over those 9 weeks, I got to know him better than I'd ever got to know him before. And I'd always liked him, but I liked him even more. And I'm even more impressed with him. He was so brilliant. And of course, his ideas The ideas he put in The Origin of Species were as transformative of the history of science and culture as any ideas anyone ever published. And so I think to spend an evening in his company would be terrific. Now, in giving you this answer, I'm giving an answer that I'm aware Stephen Jay Gould once gave when asked a similar question. And Gould said that probably you'd find that actually before you knew it, Darwin would be asking the questions, because that's how he was. He has this enlarged curiosity, like Joyce, like Gould, like the other people I admire, Weldon. And so, yeah, the conversation might end up being less instructive for me.
Yeah,
but still, it would be a thrill.
Great stuff. Oh, lovely stuff. Right, well, just to finish off with the last two questions, going back to the university side of things, what would you tell any new students joining university within the next few years? What would you like to tell, I should say?
Well, I think we're at a moment when it is so difficult to know what careers will look like in the immediate future, in the short term, and in the medium and long term, and so at university, in some ways, one of the best investments you can make is to be able to turn yourself into the kind of person that can adapt quickly to different kinds of environments. And so whether you're studying the sciences, whether you're studying the humanities, social sciences, whether you're somewhere in between, I think to whatever it is that you're studying, to do it in a way that ensures that you come out with the ability to express yourself clearly, to be able to get on top of complex information as commandingly as you can, and also to be able to make connections across different kinds of knowledge. Sometimes people talk about siloing, that you end up having students who are just able to do what they need to do on their patch, but not able to kind of think beyond that. And so I think to deliberately put yourself in situations that force you to become the kind of thinker that can make connections, that can only be to the good. Inevitably, I would suggest that any degree should have some HPS in it somewhere, but that's hand on heart. I gave a talk once where I pointed out that, as I'll do this to undergraduates as well, that three of the most creative scientific thinkers of the modern era, Charles Darwin in biology, Albert Einstein in physics, and Noam Chomsky in linguistics, they're also three of the most philosophically literate and historically knowledgeable scientists of their era, and that's no accident. That to be a scientist, but to have this hinterland intellectually, can make you a more effective scientist, because it can make you critically powerful in ways that then go on to translate into better, more creative work. On the other side, if you're a humanist, and maybe through one thing or another you've ended up alienated from the sciences, from technology, from medicine, then the history and philosophy of science can be a way back in. So I teach a module, I just taught a module called Darwin, Germs, and the Bomb. And of course, the germs part of it was timely this year in ways that no one anticipated when we invented the course. But I'm hopeful that for the kind of people to whom the history of science appeals, seeing historically, for example, how vaccines came about can be a way of breaking down a sense that it's not your world, it's just something you have to defer to other people about, that actually you can get your mind around how vaccines work. And starting at the beginning of modern vaccines, with Pasteur, at the end of the 19th century is a very inviting way in. Likewise, in looking at the development of the atomic bomb, teaching students about the attempts during the Manhattan Project to get enough fissile uranium that could work in the bomb, and teaching them about uranium-235 and 239 enrichment. That suddenly, when you hear news stories, as we heard recently about the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist, on the basis of evidence that uranium is being enriched in Iran, that all of that suddenly becomes intelligible to them. So to I think have a little bit of HPS in whatever form, whether in the form of a module or like you're doing, Fariha, as part of a degree, I think it gives you a chance to engage more broadly on the other side, whatever the other side is, and that has to be to the good.
Yeah, definitely. I think just having some form of context within your work just makes it so much more tangible. You can definitely see how all of these things fit in to the world we see today and the consequences we see as a result of certain decisions. We just need to respect the discipline a lot more. So I definitely agree with that.
Good.
Fantastic. Right. Well, I believe we've landed at the final question, which is, what is your number one piece of advice you'd give to a student? I should say.
It comes back to something I said in relation to getting an article into a journal. I think you just have to be prepared to put in the work. The uni flies by. 3 years are gone in the blink of an eye. And even within our semesters, they're 11 weeks. And before you know it, it's over. And so I think to make the most of it, you want to hit the ground running and be prepared to put in the work. The more you put in, the more you'll get out. It's a cliche, but it's really true. And that's how we people like me can teach, but only you can do the learning. And ultimately, that comes down to you pushing yourself to really get on top of the material and to go further, to be independent in your reading and thinking. And the more you put into your uni degree, the better off you'll be afterwards. Whether it's in terms of the degree class that you get, if you leave uni with a first or a 2-1. It will make life so much easier for you than if you leave with a 2-2 or something lower. So in that kind of instrumental respect, it's totally worth putting the work in. But more than that, you only realize in retrospect that it's kind of amazing that life gave you this privilege of having 3 years to do nothing other than learn. It probably won't happen again, not for a long time. And it's just extraordinary if you're lucky enough for it to happen for you. And so you absolutely want to grab it with both hands. And of course, that means participating in clubs and social activities. That's all part of a rich uni experience. But the actual academic work, where you get a chance to cultivate your mind, as Fariha was just saying, to expand your sense of the context that you find yourself in, the wider world in which you're going to continue to move, the better off you'll be, and also the more you'll enjoy yourself. The more things in life that are kind of alive and articulate to you, the more that you can appreciate and enjoy in the way that a Joyce or a Gould, shows you. The more you'll get out of it. The easier it is to keep up a kind of zest, which is kind of what makes life worth living. Above all, I would say take it seriously. Take it seriously. Put in the work. Do all those other things, but if you put in the work, you'll reap the rewards.
Amazing.
Amazing.